So this is the second in a two-part series on a Spanish variation of the Four Knights game. So in part one, we saw White's move five and Bishop to A4, but in this one, we'll look at White's move five, Bishop to C4. So after the moves pawn to E4, pawn to E5, knight F3, knight C6, knight C3, knight F6. Bishop to b5 introduces the Spanish variation, and I recommend this move knight to d4. And now instead of bishop to a4, White can play bishop to c4. Now this leads to some interesting play after Black plays the interesting bishop to c5, gambiting the pawn on e5. Now to better understand, some of the key ideas in the position, let's follow a game between Lipecki and Fessler from the Swiss Championships. I think it was the email championships in 2011. After bishop to c5, White grabbed the pawn with knight takes e5. This was not a blunder per se, but it gave Black a lot of chances. And here we have the classic case of material. So here White has extra material, as in an extra pawn, versus time and initiative. So in return for the pawn, Black's going to have a lot of time and initiative, which we'll see in the game. At the end of the video, I'll show you what White should have played instead of this knight takes e5, or, well, alternative to knight takes e5. Here, the key move for Black was queen to e7. And it turns out that none of the captures on f7 for White are really good. In the game, White played knight takes f7, but if you just go back and move, bishop takes f7 check is also not very good, because after king to f8, the knight has to move. The knight's on the thread. Either the knight has to be moved, or it has to be defended, in which case the bishop on f7 will fall. F4 is no good, because after d6, the knight has to move, and the bishop on f7 falls. If you go back and move, knight to d3 also fails to king takes f7. And yeah, White has some compensation, but is it enough? I don't think so. So for example, a typical continuation would be something like castle's kingside, but after pawn to d6, maybe even knight takes d5, because White has to try and develop the bishop on c1. While pawn takes d5, d3 to develop the bishop would simply be met by a rook to f8, and the black king is going to safety. So yeah, this isn't any good for White. So going back to the position after queen to e7, the key move for White in this position is to simply go back with knight to f3, but it leads to very long, complicated lines, which we'll also look at towards the end of the video. But for now, let's just follow the game. Knight takes f7 was played, and this was met by the instructive pawn to d5. Now the point here is the pawns getting in the way of the bishop, protecting the knight at f7. So for example, White doesn't have time for bishop takes d5, and the point is that after bishop takes d5, Black has a number of ways. He can go knight takes d5 first, and after knight takes d5, queen takes f7 should be good enough to win. But just going back to the position after bishop d5, the other move for Black as well is even to play bishop to g4, and the point is that after pawn f3, bishop takes f3 is a strong reply. Pawn takes f3 would be met by knight takes d5. So this is a clearance exchange. So after knight takes d5 and knight takes d5, we see the point here is queen h4 with a strong attack. King f2 is impossible, so he'd have to play king f1, but then we get castle's kingside. with a devastating attack for black. So yeah, so just going back to the position after pawn to d5. Here, white's only try. I mean, he could try knight takes d5 as well. So just let's look at this for a second. But the problem is that after queen takes f7, yeah, he's lost a piece. I mean, he gets some compensation after knight takes f6, queen takes f6. But yeah, I'd much rather have the black pieces in this position. Okay, here white could probably try queen to h5 check, trying to regain a piece with queen takes c5. But it turns out that after queen takes e4 check, king f1, knight takes c2, and black's gonna either win the rook on a1, or deliver checkmate on e1. So here black's winning. Yeah, so going back to the game and the position after pawn to d5, white's usual continuation here is pawn takes, not pawn, knight takes h8, which happened in the game. And then after pawn takes c4, if you just do a quick check of the position, it turns out that white has won an exchange. But the problem is that this knight isn't going to escape anytime soon from the corner of the board. Okay, now in the game, white played pawn to d3, but just going back a move, I mean, considering what happened in the game, h3 to prevent bishop to g4 was probably a stronger continuation. But even here, after bishop to e6 and something like d3 and castles kingside, we see that this knight's going to be captured soon. And black would have 2 minor pieces for a rook, which is a good trade in a chess game. But yeah, so just going back to the position after pawn takes d4, white played d3 instead of h3, but then after bishop to g4, yeah, it was clear that black was winning. And the point was that after pawn to f3 and bishop to h5, yeah, black has a better developed pieces. I mean, castles queen side is happening next, and this knight on h8 is going to disappear from the board. White tried bishop to g5, but then after castles king side, pawn to g4, bishop to e8, and keeping an eye on the f7 square, so this knight can't escape anytime soon. And white played the suspicious. I mean, the position was bad enough already. Played pawn takes d4, opening the file on the queen. But then came queen to e5. I mean, black has a number of continuations here. And pawn to f4 would have been met by a simple queen retreat, with a weakened pawn on e6. So, for example, after pawn here, queen to e6, white would have to do something about this pawn on e4. And if, say, something like e5, well, queen to c6 is no bother for black. See the rook on h1. But not digressing too much, if you go back to the position after queen to e5, white played bishop to e3. But then, yeah, knight to b5, and we see why this, pawn capture on c4 wasn't such a great idea. Well, now it turns out that white was already in trouble, because after something like queen to e2, defending the bishop on e3, well, black would have played a simple knight takes c3, hitting the queen, and after pawn takes c3, queen takes c3. I mean, this rook is on the threat, the bishop is on the threat. King to f2 appears to defend both pieces, but the problem is that after bishop takes e3 check, and king can't capture on e3, so queen takes e3, rook d2 check would win white's queen. I mean, the king would have to move away, in which case the queen would fall, or if queen to e2, well, rook takes e2. So going back to the position after knight to b5, white tried to grab some material and play queen takes d8 check, but it wasn't quite enough, because after king takes d8. I mean, there's two. What you need to note here is the bishop's on the threat. Knight takes c3 is on the threat. White can't meet both threats at the same time. He tried pawn to f4, an in-between move. And after going to e6, castles, king side, the count king to c8 was played, and now bishop takes c5. But then after knight takes c3, pawn takes c3, and bishop to a4, with the threat of queen takes e4, perhaps, followed by queen takes c2. White played rook to h1, not h1, rook h to e1, defending e4. But after queen takes c4, it was clear he was winning. A few more moves were played. The bishop on c5 is on the threat, so bishop to e7, threatening a cheapo on d8. But yeah, black wasn't going to fall for that. Played pawn to b6. After bishop takes f6 and pawn takes f6, white resigned. Let's just look at what might have happened or what could have happened. King b2 to defend a2 and c3 would possibly have been met by queen to b5 check, and after king to c1, queen to c5 hitting the c3 pawn again, and if king to b2, queen to f2 hitting the c2 pawn. Nice instructive continuation, and the point being that rook c1, the only way to defend a pawn, could easily be met by bishop takes c2. Obviously, rook takes c2 won't be possible because the queen takes e1. So if we just go back to the position, after bishop takes c2, white could probably try rook to f1, threatening the queen. But after a few shuffles, queen grabs another pawn, rook to h1, queen to g2. There's not a lot white can do about this discovered check. Bishop takes e4 as a threat. Rook h to g1, queen to f2, rook g to f1, queen to e2, rook f to e1, queen to d2, and white's run out of squares to harass the queen on d2. Obviously, king to a1 or king to a3 isn't a good idea because the queen takes c3. So if he played something like knight to f7, well, the discovered check we talked about, but after king to b3, b5, and yeah, what the white king is under a lot of, he's in a whole lot of trouble. Rook e to d1 would simply be met by bishop c4 check, and if king to b4, queen to b2 check, and king to c5, bishop takes f7. It's a winning game for black. So yeah, that was a nice game for black. But if we just go back to the position after bishop to c5, here we see white played knight takes e5, and after queen to e7, we saw some interesting, we saw bishop takes f7 check didn't work because of king to f8. And in the game, we saw knight takes f7 didn't work because of d5. Well, what was white's alternative here? Well, he could have played knight to f3, and that backfires the main move. But it turns out that black has very, very instructive and very aggressive response to this. Now, the first move, the start of the whole sequence of, I would otherwise say chaos, but it turns out this has been analyzed to death and been shown to be satisfactory for black. The key move is pawn to d5, bang. Trying to blow open the position. Now we'll just, get rid of some of the simple continuations before we go into the mind-boggling complications. So knight takes d4 is simple, and the point is that after pawn takes c4, white wants to go back to f3. But after knight takes e4, castles kingside, And yeah, it turns out black's slightly better. I mean, rook to e1 is impossible because of bishop takes f2 check. And if queen to e2, then the simple knight takes c3, queen takes e7, bishop takes e7, pawn takes c3. Yeah, should lead to a roughly equal position, but black has the long-term advantage of the bishop pair. Okay, going back to the position after d5, we've just looked at knight takes d4. The other try is knight takes d5. But here, black can simply play queen takes e4, check. And now knight e3 is the only good move for white. If we just go back, it's worth pointing out here that after a move like king to e1, well, knight takes d5 wins material for black. So going back to the position after knight to e3, bishop to g4. So again, we see this recurring theme in the Spanish variation of the four knights. Black always, whenever black can get, a bishop pin on the f3 knight, it's usually very good for him. Here, white has to play bishop to e2 to do something about the pin. But after knight takes e2, queen takes e2, and castles kingside, yeah, black is getting a lot of play. For the pawn, he's only a pawn now, but look at how active his pieces are. Look at white's queen side. This knight can end up on f4 in some variations. Yeah, a typical continuation, which has been seen in quite a number of games, would be pawn to d3, and after the count, queen to e6, knight takes g4. And here it turns out that after queen takes e2 check, king takes e2, and knight takes g4, hitting the f2 square. And white's main continuation here is to return the pawn with bishop to e3. Because he's just under so much pressure. Rook to e8, rook a to e1, knight takes e3, pawn takes e3, rook takes e3 check, king to d1. And white's just about equal in this complicated variations. So going back to the position after pawn to d5, by far the most complex of all the responses for white here is this move, bishop takes d5. But then again, we see the instructed move for black, bishop to g4. Always remember bishop to g4, pinning the knight to the queen. In a Spanish variation of four knights is critical. Now it turns out white doesn't even have time for something like bishop takes b7. A sample line would be rook to b8. And yeah, bishop to d5 would be bad because of knight takes d5. Point being, a knight takes d5 would lose to queen. Takes e4 check. Note that the queen can't come to e4. So just going back to the position after bishop to g4. Yeah, bishop takes b7 is a bit slow. I mean, another line to look at after bishop takes b7 and rook b8 is bishop to a6. But again, knight takes e4. And white's best to castle because of the discovered attack on the king. But after something like bishop takes f3, pawn takes f3 is almost forced, so knight to g5. It turns out that white, black has a strong attack anyway and should be winning this one. So yeah, so going back to the position after bishop to g4, we see that bishop takes b7 is ill-advised. So in this position, the key move for white is pawn to d3. And watch, this is instructive. Castles kingside. Now white needs to do something about this, e-file. So the main move here is bishop to e3 to close the file. But watch this. Knight takes d5. Pawn takes d5 would allow bishop takes f3. So here white goes knight takes d5. And now look at this. Rook takes d5 exclam. Pawn takes d5, rook to e8. And it turns out that white's walking a tightrope to maintain equality in this position. Just to illustrate the difficulties in this position, or the intricacies of the position, castle's kingside will be met by pawn takes f3. And after pawn takes f3, we see the brilliant move bishop to d6, giving up the knight on d4. Fantastic. Now it turns out the white cannot afford to win the knight, because after a move like bishop takes d4, well, he'd be losing after queen to g5 check, and after king to h1, queen to f4, and there's not a lot the white can do about, queen takes h2, checkmate. So, after bishop to d6, it turns out the only move for white in this position. So remember I said he's walking a tightrope is to go f4. And now the key move, queen to h4. Now, this is, just watch this. I mean, if your opponent with the white pieces has never seen this position before and manages to draw, then good on him or her. Because now the key line is bishop takes d4, bishop takes f4, and I'm just going back a move. Note that queen takes f4 would lose to queen h5, when white is able to defend and will win with his extra material. Note that white's a whole rook up in the position. So just going back to the position after bishop takes c4, you have to be careful with bishop takes f4, threatening queen, takes h2 check. And now it turns out the only move for white, for white to stay in the game, is to play this move, king to g2. Amazing. Just going back a move after king to g2. I mean, what else can white play? Rook to e1 doesn't help because of queen takes h2 check, followed by checkmate on h1. Interesting. What else can he play? He can't even play bishop to e3. This queen. Well, it turns out his only move is king to g2. And now just watch this. Queen takes h2 check. King to f3. Queen to h5 check. King takes f4. Oh dear. Black was a rook down. Now he's down not just a rook, he's also down a minor piece as well. And somehow the position is still equal. Well, king to h2 check. It turns out he has perpetual check. And king to f3, queen to h3 check. King to f4, queen to h2 check. And if he tries king to f5, he even has to be careful he doesn't get checkmated after pawn to g6. Here, it's amazing to find out white's only way to draw is king to g4. And just going back a move, if he were to play the reckless rook and king to f6, hoping to hide behind the black pawns, well, it turns out that black is even winning in this position after queen to h4 check or even queen to f4 check. And the point is that after king to g7, queen takes d4 check, king to h6 only move. Well, all moves are losing at this point. Rook to g8, threatening queen to h4 mate. White would have to play pawn to f4. But then after queen to f6, there's a strong threat of pawn to g5, which is discovered check. It turns out that even the move queen to g4 check doesn't even help, because after king to b8, it turns out that queen to g5 would be a self-mate after this. So going back to the position after queen to g4 check and king to b8, queen to h3, you'll get g5 check, and amazing, white's losing. It's just, chess is just such a beautiful game. Look at this. pawn takes f4, rook to g1 doesn't even help, because after rook to g6, I mean, how is it that black is down a whole rook and still winning? I think the problem is, yeah, it's the safety of the white king. Rook a to e1, looking for cheapos on the back rank, could simply be met by a5, and rook e8 check wouldn't really do anything. And I think the key point to note here is after something like rook takes g6 and queen takes g6, king to h4 would simply be met by queen to h6 check, and if king to g4, f5 check, winning material for black. Only moves king takes f5 or king to f3, which would be met by queen takes h4. So, I mean, if we just go back to position after king to f5, after g6 check, it turns out, even in this position, where white is up a rook and a bishop, the only way for him to draw is to play king to g4. Amazing. Well, next will come f5 check. I mean, even queen g2 was possible. King to g5, queen to d2 check. And we see, yeah, king to f4 would have to be played. And yeah, lots of checks. Just going back to position after queen to d2 check. It's also worth pointing out that, again, king to f6, trying to hide away from the checks, would be losing to queen takes d5. I mean, a number of things. Queen takes d4 check is happening. Queen to d8 check as well. It's devastating, and there's not much that white can do against all these threats. If you were to go king to g5, for example, well, queen takes d4. White gains some material, but still has a mating attack. Because of this loose king in the center of the board. After queen takes d4, for example, rook h1 would allow h6, and if rook takes h6, queen takes f2, and if queen to g1, trying to swap queens, then queen to d2 check. Oh my goodness. And yeah, this rook is falling because king takes g6 is a terrible move for various reasons. Rook to g8 check is one. But even the move rook to e6 check. Oh dear. Even the move rook to e6 check is winning because of losing because of rook takes. Oh my goodness, chess is such an amazing game. Yeah, so just going back to the key position after queen to e7, we've just seen the mind-boggling complications after knight to f3 and pawn d5, and how to stay in the game. White has to remember to play this move, bishop takes d5, sorry, but then need to walk a tightrope after bishop to g4. So yeah, so it turns out, yeah, black has a really good game in this line with bishop to c4. If we go back a couple of moves to the position after bishop to c5, it's just worth noting that rather than go into all the complications with knight takes e5, which we just looked at, simpler for white would be to play pawn to d3. And after moves like pawn to d6, h3 defending bishop g4, you get a standard, typical slow maneuvering game, typical of the Italian game, king pawn opening, etc. I mean, going back again after bishop to c5, instead of d3, the other tries castles king side, and after something like pawn to d6, just play knight takes d4. Bishop takes d4, d3. Again, with an equal position, bishop g4 could be met by knight to e2, with h3 to come next. So yeah, So just to do a recap, if we go to the main position in the Spanish variation, the four knights, after bishop to c4, I recommend bishop to c5, gambiting the pawn. White can take the pawn on e5, but he gets into some very tricky positions. I think he should just go d3 in this position, because after knight takes d5 and queen to e7, we see black gets the slightly better of the complicated games, and white has to walk a tightrope to stay in the game. Yeah, I hope you liked this one. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, and I hope to see you on the next one.